The still slightly shaken-looking Mia's eyes scanned James up and down, while his hair slowly started to settle down after standing up straight so suddenly. Now that James's face, and only his, had been revealed, the man seemed to latch onto it as a thing of comfort, making unusually deep eye contact whenever their gazes met while Tshirt studied him. Finally, the glass-green gaze of the feline came to an enduring halt, and his breathing settled back into a steadier rhythm while he stared down at the extended hand offered to him. At first, he remained wordless, and seemed slightly insecure about how he should react to the gesture, despite having performed it himself just earlier. But then, his features hardened as his brows furrowed and his eyes narrowed, while his upper lip twitched upwards ever so slightly, revealing the briefest flash of strikingly white teeth behind it. "One thing you should know about me, Gyostai," he said darkly, mushing up a decisive tone even through the last remnants of the previous shock that still lingered in his voice, and in an almost imperious gesture, he forcefully swung up his right hand, pushing James's offered left aside instead of shaking it. Afterwards, Tshirt kept his hand up in an apparent counteroffer, as he finished with, "I do not take well to being patronized." Despite it being shoved aside so rudely, James still held his left hand up for a second, looking down at it briefly, before finally letting it sink down with a scoff. With curiously pursed lips, he then glanced up at Tshirt's determined stare, and only slowly did his eyes wander downwards towards the newly offered hand. Suddenly, quick as the crack of a whip, James's artificial right hand snapped around in an unnatural movement, shooting up from its resting state like a head of a striking snake, with the arm following behind it like the beast's limbless body. With lightning-like reflexes, Tshirt pulled his hand upwards just before James's grabbing appendage could reach it, his determined face momentarily cracking into a renewed expression of shock, as his eyes turned wide and his nostrils widely flared, which in turn caused a self-satisfied smirk to creep across James's lips while he lifted an eyebrow at the feline. Having finished its unnatural display, James's arm now remained unmoving, continuing this strange battle of offered hands, while looking almost no different from any other arm in the room now that it was no longer in motion. James stared at the man expectantly, his eyebrows remaining interestedly raised while he waited for Tshirt's next move. Tshirt still stood with his hand held upwards, just a heartbeat away from James's. Once again, he forced his face into a stern look, suppressing the hesitation and apprehension he very clearly felt towards the mechanical limb. His green eyes shot up to stare into James's. "Loose the glove," he briefly commanded, in a tone that was maybe a bit too used to giving orders to people, because he seemingly realized as much himself and quickly cleared his throat, adding in a more democratic voice, "Please." James perked up in surprise, his head cocking to the side ever so slightly. How interesting. After no more than a second of contemplation, he smilingly complied, pulling his hand back for a brief moment to remove the leather covering he wore on it, revealing the finely woven grey polymer that replaced his skin underneath. Demonstratively, he bent and stretched his fingers a couple of times as soon as they had been revealed, before reaching the hand out one final time. Seemingly now also finally satisfied, Tshirt brought his arm forward simultaneously, and finally their hands met, closing around each other tightly for a second while they gave a few brisk yet firm shakes, before already releasing each other again and pulling their arms back to their sides. It may have seemed slightly silly from the outside, and it probably looked the part as well, as they had constantly extended and retracted their hands in their strange little dance. However, their seemingly innocuous interaction had laid a bit of important groundwork on how this whole conversation was going to pan out. And so far, James wasn't dissatisfied. "It is a pleasure, Ambassador," Tshirt assured him, although a brief twitching of his eyes and lips betrayed the fact that, despite his insistence on it being that way, a part of him wasn't all too happy about the artificial hand's touch, as if the man's body was trying to subtly rebel against the decision his mind had made. "The pleasure is mine," James still concurred, with a quick nod of his head. Then, before he could continue, a new bit of movement in the corner of his vision caught his eye, and he glanced over at Shida, who appeared to be sunning at him in order to gain his attention subtly, and without having to reveal her voice as well, at least for the moment. James and Tshirt both looked at her, studying the movements of her arms interestedly as she asked, "Does this mean I can take this thing off as well?" Tshirt's ears wiggled interestedly, and James could only assume that the man was musing about who was under that helmet, with the curious, yet annoyed expression projected onto its visor, while James looked over the faces of his accompanying guards for any signs of disapproval, as they had surely also noticed the question. Finding nothing that would speak against it, he made an affirming gesture with his arm. It would be pretty unfair telling her to keep the filter on despite having taken it off himself, while she was the one who technically didn't need to wear it at all. Wearing it also was a lot more uncomfortable for her than it was for him, and as was to be expected, she let out a sort of satisfied groan while pulling the helmet-like apparatus off of her face as it disengaged with a loud hiss. Soon after, she also set her tail free once again, waving it around happily. Once she held the filter in her hand, she strongly shook out her head, making her voluminous hair wildly rustle around, while her large ears slowly recovered from being tightly compressed for so long, slowly standing back up to their full height. She even reached up to massage her ears briefly, before finally feeling recovered enough to return to her previous attentive posture, and look back at Tshirt, who studied her with mild interest on his face. "I should have expected that," he admitted with a chortle, and looked at the ground. James also chuckled. "Well, now that you can talk," he said, with a glance over at his girlfriend, and her newly freed ears twitched excitedly as she was being addressed. "You can tell me what he's been calling us this whole time." As if he needed to clarify who he was talking about, James nodded over towards Tshirt. She'd nodded and briefly cleared her throat as she also looked at the man. "Goestai," she said, and her musing face told James that she was contemplating how exactly to explain that specific way of addressing them, and it almost seemed like she was looking for a bit of an explanation as well. It's a rather antiquated way of addressing someone. To be honest, I've only ever heard of it in stories and had no idea that it was still being used, but it's the name of our creator deity. Well, the biggest one, that is. James nodded out of instinct before suddenly realizing what he had just heard, his gaze doubling back at Sheeta. "Creator deity?" he asked for clarification, forgetting himself for a second. "Indeed," Tshirt then subtly confirmed before Sheeta had the chance to do so, making James's gaze snap around towards him. "Goestai was the one who collected what is now our world, and today you shall carry his name as an expression of my respect." "Tshirt puts great stock into traditions and conventions," the voice from the table suddenly clarified further, sounding energetic and eager to make up for their earlier faux pas in any way they could. "Please be assured that this truly is a sign of his highest respect." James scoffed and looked over at the speaker, faithfully transmitting the unknown voice to them. "I'm not so sure how much reassurance I can gain from someone whose face I've never seen," he commented, with clear distrust now that he had ground to stand on in that regard. "I don't even know your name." The voice didn't reply to that immediately, and it was likely that it didn't have a fitting retort right away, so Tshirt quickly jumped in for them. "My employee prefers it to remain anonymous whenever possible," he explained, with an almost dismissive gesture of his hand that formed a wide wave away from his body. "I am very sorry, but the precaution is necessary on my side," the voice unwaveringly confirmed what their employer had said, and their tone gave away that they weren't too happy about that fact themselves, if only because it sowed further distrust between their employer and James. "However, if a name would help you trust me even a little bit more, then you may call me Avezalon." "Well then, Avezalon," Sheeta chimed in, before James could truly react to that new bit of information, and the feline sounded almost like she was pursuing a piece of prey with her most direct voice. "How did you know it was James under that mask?" So, apparently that was what had ultimately caused all that uproar earlier. He had decided to reveal his identity to quell things before they had got out of hand. But apparently, he hadn't revealed quite as much as he had expected, even if it had still worked. However, if this mystery person really had seen through his disguise that easily, he would also be interested in how. "What do you mean?" Avezalon asked without missing a beat. "I simply recognized his voice when he spoke." Sheeta smacked her lips in annoyance, and James let out a sharp breath through his nose. "Unlikely," he commented. "I don't even recognize my own voice when I'm wearing that thing." Tshirt now loudly cleared his throat, lifting a hand to his mouth to further emphasize the gesture. He then said something to the speaker in his mother tongue, leaving James to wonder what was being said as he quickly looked over to Sheeta to once again gauge her reaction to the conversation. but she remained mostly stone-faced as she listened. After he had said whatever he had to say, Tshirt turned back towards James, tapping his finger on his arm expectantly. "Apologies," Avesalon then spoke up again shortly after. This being another one of those rare occasions when their voice seemed to briefly falter. "I usually don't want to daunt people and therefore don't reveal too much to them, but I shouldn't have insulted you like that. You see, the computers that I observe and hear you through, they do more than just transmit me through the visual and auditory feed. I don't get the clean feed of the conversation, so to speak. And your voice is one of those things that the system automatically altered, returning it to its usual sound before showing it to me. Again, I apologize." James's eyebrows furrowed as he tried to think about that. Automatically altered feed? Sure, such a thing existed. But involuntarily unscrambled voice? In less time than it took to say a single sentence? Was that realistic? Inadvertently, he looked back over his shoulder, seeking the face of Admir, who was still guarding one side of the door. Despite it only being a projection in vague shapes, his face looked about as confused on the matter as James felt, as even he could only lift his shoulders to a shrug. It sounded just about believable at best, given that they didn't know exactly what kind of technology the Miat might have at their disposal. James couldn't really think of a better explanation as well. If it existed, what else might such a program reveal about him automatically without his knowledge? And that was a big if. It was all quite disconcerting. However, it wasn't quite enough to end the conversation outright. And his look back had also reminded him of something else that should probably be cleared up before they continued any further. "Well then," he said, with a certain finality in his voice, ending the previous topic for the time being, before starting a new one. "We'll get back to that later. For now, I do have to ask, what exactly are these children doing here in your office?" He reached a hand back to point at the now at least no longer huddled group of kids that seemed to slowly regain their previous pert confidence now that the humans were no longer behaving overly threatening or defensive. Some of them had already loosened from the wall again, and were inquisitively watching the, to them, not quite understandable conversation, while some others still seemed more appreciative about putting any attention towards themselves accidentally. That second group now slightly flinched as they realized from James's gesture that they had now become topic of said conversation. However, Tshirt remained oddly nonchalant about the kindergarten in his office. "Don't mind the kittens," he said, with the same dismissive gesture from before. "They don't understand what is going on anyway, so just leave them be as we talk." But James crossed his arms and looked back at the feline with an unamused expression. "I'm not worried about them overhearing us," he clarified with a stern voice. They wouldn't allow for much backtalk at the best of times, much less so while he was flanked by armed guards. "I'm asking what they are doing here." Tshirt's eyes narrowed truculently, and his tail began to swing left to right in a slow, wave-like motion as he regarded James. "That would be my fault again," a voice suddenly pierced the room, breaking the brief standoff apart as both participants surprisingly turned towards its source on the table. Avesalon paused briefly to give the two time to adjust before they continued. "Tshirt is taking care of the children in my name. Some of them are the children of single parents who work in this facility, and therefore don't have time to take care of them during the day. Others have lost both of their parents, leaving me as their current guardian. However, to my great shame, I cannot currently care for them in the thorough way that they deserve, which is why Tshirt has taken it upon himself to watch over them in my stead, as they have no other place to go. You may have noticed that this place currently is not exactly ideal for children." Tshirt smacked his lips and let out a sharp breath through clenched teeth, slightly rolling his eyes. Apparently he wasn't quite happy about that arrangement. Still, it seemed like that wasn't enough to deny Avesalon this request, even though so far the relationship between the two had constantly been described with Tshirt as the employer and Avesalon as the employee. It appeared that there had to be more to it. "Why not send at least the orphans to a brat house?" She'd then asked with a curious flick of her ears. An interesting question, especially given her own experiences in her childhood. But even more interesting was the response. "No," Avesalon immediately replied, with a surprising firmness behind it. "I don't want that. I am their guardian, and I will not lay down that responsibility unless I can be certain that they will be cared for properly." She'd scoffed. "That's kind of what those places exist for," she countered unapologetically, and was clearly looking to tease something out of the mystery person. wherever she could. However, when it came to that topic, Avesalon seemed to be quite certain of their standpoint, so they replied, "No, they aren't. They may keep the children alive there, but they don't care for them." Sheeta's eyes slightly widened, and the swaying of her tail became slower. She briefly opened her mouth to reply something, but then closed it again right away. Finally, she mumbled, "I guess that's not inaccurate," more to herself than as a real reply. Following that, Tshirt cleared his throat demonstratively once again. "If you want, I can provide you with the necessary evidence that all these children are here legally, under my guardianship," he assured James. And for what it was worth, James believed him. "Just don't mind them. They will not bother us while we go about our business." James sighed slowly, waving his hand to concede the point. Once again, he wasn't exactly comfortable with this, but there also seemed to be no really good argument against it. After all, Tshirt had called him here, so if he was comfortable with the kids being around for whatever he had to discuss, it was unlikely that James would have to object to that. "Fine then," he said, lifting his gaze to look into Tshirt's green eyes, as the dark-skinned Miat looked back at him with a now seemingly satisfied look on his face. "In that case, I think I've held up the proceedings for long enough now. It is time to discuss why you've called me here." Tshirt smirked and took this acknowledgement from James as an invitation to finally turn on his heels and move back behind his desk with slow, sauntering steps. Finally, he sank back into his large chair with a satisfied exhale, before briefly throwing his head to the side to release a noticeable cracking noise from his neck. Knowing Miat, it sounded like he had held a truly unhealthy amount of tension during their conversation. Now that he sat again, it also seemed that his carefully curated posture slightly cracked, as he allowed himself to briefly wipe across his forehead, before stopping to hold it with a flat hand in a fleeting moment of weakness. As quickly as it had overcome him, it was also gone again, and Tshirt soon looked back up at James with a firm and expecting look. The now quite strong distance in elevation didn't seem to bother the man all that much. "Why do people of our status ever meet with each other?" he asked rhetorically, finally responding to James's earlier question while waving around an open, padded palm invitingly. "To discuss business, of course. From what I hear, your ventures so far have proven to be less than promising." Well, that certainly wasn't untrue. James remembered Sheeta's words. Don't be nice. Don't give people the benefit of the doubt. Therefore, he stood up straight, widening the gap in elevation between him and Tshirt even more, while looking down at him with stern eyes. "If there is something you want from me, I would prefer it if you asked for it directly instead of trying to get me to ask something of you," he said firmly. Usually he would have brought his arms behind his back to bring his chest out even more, or taking up a more or less imposing position. However, he remembered that that was usually seen as a sign of respect among the Miat, so he suppressed the urge, crossing his arms instead. "I may be looking for allies, but I do not need you as an ally. So do keep in mind that it was you who called me here and tell me what you wanted when you did so." This time, he wouldn't give up his position quite so easily. And Tshirt seemed to be quite happy with that, as a smirk crept over his face. Lowering his hand, he began to tap onto the table with the blunt back of one of his claws, while he looked off into the distance for a moment. "I deal in pleasure and comfort, Gyostai," he finally said, starting his explanation in a rather roundabout way. "It is a lucrative business on this planet, but not the most lucrative." Then his sharp eye snapped up to look at James again, as he added, "Do you know what is?" James lifted an eyebrow. Was this a test? Or was the man just trying to spin a rhetoric here? Only one way to see where this was going. "Animal products," he replied matter-of-factly, remembering as much from the many things he had to learn about the planet before he came here. Food, mostly. He remembered it as an interesting difference from Earth, where food was far from the most lucrative commodity one could base their business around, which was why he had it stuck in his mind. Carfwem had made his not inconsiderable fortune with the comestible business, and today that had made him the de facto leader of his people. James knew that much. "Indeed, food," Tshirt replied slowly, his gaze turning more intense as it seemed like he wanted to pierce through James's skull with his eyes alone. "But it wasn't always like this. After all, it is hard to make money with something that is quite abundant." Tshirt sat up straighter, and brought his hands together, interweaving his fingers with each other. Anyone can make food, Gostai, Zishiji said tonelessly. All you need is 2 monkeys and a bit of land, and a few rodents if you're feeling fancy. Nature does the rest. James impatiently started to tap his arm with his finger, while some glances were exchanged by the people around him, as they likely tried to guess where this was going. Is there a rest stop between now and your point? James asked, with played-up irritation, if only to disrupt Zishiji from peacefully spinning his yarn. The man shouldn't get too comfortable while trying to play out whatever he had pre-planned for this meeting in his mind, and James wanted to let him know as much. The point is, Zishiji replied, now indeed slightly ruffled by James constantly disrupting the flow of the conversation, as he brought out a flat hand down onto the desk's plate with gentle force. If it is that simple, then how can it be that lucrative? Pushing both hands against the edge of his desk, Zishiji pushed himself back onto his seat, leaning back strongly to more easily look up at James, while his arms remained outstretched against the table. You have enemies, Gyostai, he said, with strong emphasis on each word, his ears standing up straight and pointing right towards James. Everyone does that, even here. And I have the same enemies. You have a saying about that back on Earth, don't you? About your enemies' enemies? The complex's constant gentle humming noise filled the air, as the room turned silent for a moment following his words. Contemplative glances were once again thrown around, and this time James joined in the wordless exchange of thoughts. It seemed that none of the humans were quite so sure about this declaration, and neither was Shida. After he had made sure he hadn't missed any vital input from anybody, James turned back towards the dark-skinned feline. A very outdated one, yes, James replied to his inquiry, making sure to get it across that he didn't plan to blindly follow that philosophy here, even if it turned out that they truly had the same enemies. But I still don't see the overlap. Zishiji nodded and exhaled slowly. Kwafrem is a brilliant man, he sully admitted outright, before he elaborated any further, setting a very strange tone for the explanation he was about to give them right at the start. So brilliant that it has made him dangerous to everyone. In a blink-and-you-miss-it gesture, Zishiji's eyes twitched over towards the speaker on his desk for a fraction of a second, before he continued. I don't know if he planned it from the start, or if he just had an opportunity presented to him and took it. However, with the help of our mutual enemies, he currently has this planet in a tight grasp. The feline paused briefly, and a quivering bulge of muscle underneath the skin on his cheeks told of him tightly clenching his jaws. As you can imagine, as a businessman myself, I can hardly tolerate this, he finished his explanation. I've been trying to lessen his influence for a long time now, and he has never been as vulnerable as he is today. However, compared to him, even my resources are limited. The cyber attacks on the supply chain, James could hear admin mumble in English behind him. However, to his shock and surprise, the change of language wasn't enough to obscure what he was saying. Now, let's not make any accusations we can't take back later, alright? Avesalon's voice came out of the speaker crystal clearly. Did their computers have an integrated translator as well? How annoying. Zishiji didn't quite seem to understand what the outburst was about, but he also didn't ask about it any further. However, for everyone who had understood the exchange, it was quite clear that the mystery person wanted to cover their basics, although they with that basically confirmed that it wasn't unlikely that Admir had indeed been on the right track. And that gave James quite the bitter taste in his mouth. Those supply chain issues weren't fun and games. They were causing legitimate problems to the people affected, enough so to take up a significant chunk of the news, even if they had been going on for a while. Was that really worth it to limit a food supplier's influence? So, you want my help with limiting his influence? James asked matter-of-factly, if only to see where this was going before he outright rejected this. Not yours, Zishiji immediately clarified, astoundingly candid with his own motivations. Your people's. What I need is resources. Earth had resources. More than enough. Way more than even Kwafwem. However, to get to Earth, I have to go through you. He clasped his hands together, sitting up as straight as he could while looking at James with big eyes that hid a wild mixture of emotions behind them. What you want, it is choice, yes? He now asked directly, apparently doubling down on this whole go through James plan. Choice to wear clothing or to not, to eat meat or to not, and even when you lose an arm. He paused briefly to point towards James's cybernetic prosthetic. You want people to have the choice to say if they want one of those things or not, right? He continued his question, now looked up at James in search of confirmation. You don't want everyone to get one. You just want people to have the choice, so if they want one for whatever reason, they can get one, right? James was slightly taken aback by the sudden questioning of his goals, and he inadvertently reached for his forehead to briefly stroke his hand across his hair. Well, it doesn't end there, but if that's what you want to focus on, he replied, unsure of how much information he should volunteer here, deciding that it was probably best to just let Tshirt make his point and decline later. I can live with that, Tshirt said without missing a beat, now drumming his claws on the desk with a, for some reason, pretty unhappy look on his face. I'm not happy with it, but I can live with that. It is the best chance we have, according to Avezalon, and I trust her judgment. The drumming stopped as Tshirt brought his hands flat down onto the table and pushed himself to his feet. If your people support the people of Dunima, then the people of Dunima will support your people, and by extension you. They know we have dealings with the current council, which is why they wanted it to stay in power. However, if I can get better dealings with a new council, they will support that instead. You understand me, right? That's what you're after, isn't it? He asked, with an intense glare into James's eyes. Technically, that was true. Getting as much support as he could from Dunima's enormous population would certainly be a great boon for him. However, I can't make such a decision by myself, he replied very clearly. And even if he could have, he certainly wouldn't even think of agreeing to something that sounded akin to hostile takeover, without at least discussing it with the people he was signing up for it. You'll speak for your people, don't you? Tshirt asked him with the same intense glare. Only to a point, James replied honestly. I can start diplomatic relations. However, I cannot make huge promises like you are asking me to. Many more people, far more influential than I am, are necessary for that. He let that statement sit for a moment while looking back at Tshirt with an empty expression, not wishing to give away his thoughts on the matter too freely. The dark-skinned Mia stared into his eyes for a little longer, before he allowed himself to sink back into his chair, his hand reaching for his forehead in a soothing manner once more, as his eyes briefly closed shut in discomfort as he shook his head. However, James then added, making Tshirt's ears, that had previously been hanging down in accordance with his now slumped posture, suddenly perk up and turn towards him. Since Earth is currently looking for allies, I will certainly bring these circumstances, as well as your proposal, to my people's attention. Many of them are experts that will know exactly how to proceed with this, should they decide to do so. Personally, I can't make any promises. However, as Qualfame has shown himself unwilling to even get into conversation with us, I don't see why we wouldn't try to find allies in his opposition. If you give us a way to reliably reach you, I'm sure my people will at the very least get into contact with you. The many hundreds of analysts, business people and career politicians back home will surely have much more fun and success working through this mess than he ever would. He was only here to promote his face, and because his name carries some weight. Other people would work through the nitty-gritty of the diplomatic details. We accept. The clear voice of Avezalon suddenly rang out from the speaker, sounding very sure about that, despite very clearly not having talked about it with her supposed employer yet. I will organize a route of communication for your people and send you the necessary contact data very shortly. James made a mental note to tell the people back home to make doubly and triply sure that any line they used while contacting these people was doubly and triply secure, just to be sure. Avezalon was giving him a very strange feeling, and it was probably better to not take any chances with her, as long as it could be avoided. He briefly glanced at Tshirt, waiting to see if he had something to say about his employee taking the lead like that. However, the man seemed to have somewhat deflated again as he sat in the chair, now actively avoiding it to even look at James, or any of the humans for that matter. He looked hot, maybe even slightly fevery. At least he was unusually sweaty for a Miat in this climate. Slowly shaking his head, the man finally spoke up again. However, all he said was, "Oh, it is a very bad time for this," speaking seemingly more to himself than to his guests, before he added, "If that is your final word, then please leave now. If you have any further questions, Avezalon will answer them for you. We will remain in correspondence." He lazily waved a hand towards the door as if trying to shoo the humans away. With his eyebrows raised and his face wrinkled in slight concern, James nodded and turned to his company to indicate that they would be going now. However, there was no need for him to do even that much. Everyone was already ready to leave the second that he had turned his head. However, they were suddenly stopped as the request, "Please wait just a moment longer," echoed throughout the room. One last time today, everyone turned towards the nondescript yet ever-important speaker on top of the desk, as a Veselon spoke up to get their attention. "I'll have someone come get you. Sadly, I must insist for the moment that you do not traverse the complex unsupervised. I hope you can understand that." James groaned audibly, but nodded and briefly stretched himself. The constant posturing he had kept up towards the end of the conversation had taken a bit of a toll on his muscles, and he felt the ache of his shoulders under the added weight of the new arm, as well as its counterbalance more than ever now. He also could have sworn that, in the corners of his vision, he had seen Tshirt briefly wince once his stretching had reached its apex, although that might have been just his imagination. Seeing nothing else to do while they waited, Jameson took a few quick steps through the ever-humming room, crossing it within the blink of an eye, and coming to a halt in front of the group of more pert kittens that had stepped closer and closer ever since it had become clear to them that the conversation of the adults was coming to a close. Most of them recoiled away from him, not quite curious enough to actually make contact again after the threatening display of the humans earlier. However, one small girl with relatively light skin and exceptionally dark stripes remained firm, looking up at James with big, lime green eyes. He knelt down in front of her and reached out, gently ruffling her wild hair with his left arm, something that she apparently appreciated, if only because it meant that she was getting attention. "You've caused quite a bit of problems," he said, knowing fully well that she wouldn't understand him. Obviously, he wasn't actually deflecting the blame for his earlier mistake onto the child either. He just wanted to say something, and nothing else came to mind. The girl kept enjoying the attention given to her, to the great envy of many of her playmates, pressing her head against James's hand until her eyes fell onto James's other, more attention-grabbing hand. Before James had even quite noticed what had happened, two little hands were holding onto his, and he could feel tiny yet pointy claws digging into the polymer replacing his skin. It didn't hurt exactly. The arm wasn't programmed to feel like that, but the feeling certainly wasn't comfortable. "Okay," he said, with a slightly strained voice, and used his other hand to gently remove the tiny grasses from his arm. "That's enough." Unexpectedly, at least to him, his effort earned him a quick bite to his organic arm. Not nearly hard enough to break skin, but certainly enough to make him quickly pull back his arm in surprise, and a general sound of giggling and snickering around him let him know that his company had not missed it either. Meanwhile, the girl was starting to cling onto his hand even tighter, as she started to put some weight behind her action. This was now entering not good territory, and although James had to admit that he also saw a certain humour in the situation, it was time to resolve it now. But, as he was just in the process of turning around to possibly ask for a little help, he suddenly felt slender yet strong arms wrap over his shoulder and around his neck, as a weight started to press against his back. Soon, a dark head with wild hair appeared right next to his, as Sheeta snuggled up to him, rubbing her cheek against his while purring loudly. This wasn't exactly the kind of help he had had in mind. However, to his surprise, the display of affection had exactly the intended effect, as the girl almost immediately pulled her claws out of his hand and slightly backed away, while looking up at Sheeta with a bit of a pout on her face. James looked at her and then glanced at Sheeta's face. They were still snuggling against his. Thanks?" he chuckled confusedly. "You're welcome," Sheeta cooed in his ear under constant purring, before turning her head to briefly lick across his cheek, which made the kid back up one step further. James now officially had no idea what was happening, but he decided to use the opportunity, standing back up to his full height while simply lifting Sheeta, who still clung onto him, up with him. Shortly after, she let herself fall off his back and landed back on her feet. The breath filters of his surrounding friends didn't quite convey it. However, James was sure they all had quite explicit looks on their faces underneath. Meanwhile, Tshirt seemed to avoid looking at him even more than before. But before anyone had time to give each other any shit for what had just happened, their chaperones had finally arrived, loudly knocking on the door. Offering little more than brief words of goodbye, the two parties parted, as the humans and Sheeta were guided back towards their shuttle by a, this time significantly smaller group of armed Miat. Before the group was closed completely behind them, James glanced back one last time. The last thing he saw in the room was Tshirt, as he pulled out a large white package of sorts. Quickly, he ripped something out of it and stuck it in his mouth, swallowing heavily. Then, the door closed shut.